My colleague Peter Atkins, whose works I recommend to you, I think that it's high time that a scientist won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and Peter Atkins would be my nominee for that. He was once invited to give a lecture in Windsor Castle, which, as you know, is one of the homes of the British monarch. And at the end of his lecture, Prince Philip said, "You scientists are awfully good at answering the how questions, but what about the why question?" And Peter Atkins said, "Sir, the why question is just a silly question." We humans are obsessed with purpose. It seems perfectly natural when we're presented with an object to say, what's it for? It starts in childhood. The psychologist Deborah Kellerman has investigated this very interestingly with children, offering them a question like, why do you think these rocks are pointy? Is it because of some geological explanation, geological cause, or is it so that animals could scratch on them when they get itchy? And below a certain age, I think it's about 6, most children answer with the teleological answer with the purpose question. Yes, they're pointy so that animals can scratch on them when they get itchy. Children then mostly grow out of that purposive way of looking at the world, but not apparently everybody. In medieval times, I've got to try to work this. Who's good with iPads? I'm trying to get... Oh, here we are. Okay. In medieval times, divines would look at living things and see purpose for human benefit in them. In the 19th century, the Reverend William Paley thought that the louse was an indispensable incentive to cleanliness. Savage beasts, according to an Elizabethan bishop, fostered human courage and provided useful training for war. Horseflies, for an 18th century writer, were created so that men should exercise their wits and industry to guard themselves against them. Lobsters were given hard shells so that before eating them we could benefit from the improving exercise of cracking their claws. Another medieval writer thought that weeds were there to benefit us. It's so good for our spirit to have to work hard pulling them up. Now, it's not difficult to see that such people would also have found purpose in the physical world, in mountains. What's the purpose of a mountain? What's the purpose of a stream? We humans love to see purpose everywhere. And it's one of the great achievements of science, I think especially Darwin, but other scientists as well, to show that the impulse that we have to see purpose in anything doesn't work. And he did it not with the easy things like mountains. I mean, essentially any fool could see that mountains don't have a purpose. He did it with living things. And living things on the face of it have purpose written all over them. We look at a bird's wing, an engineer looks at a bird's wing, an albatross wing, say, and sees that it's perfectly designed for the particular way of flying that albatrosses have. Swifts have a different way. You look at an eye, you look at a heart, you look at a kidney. Everything looks designed. The Reverend William Paley himself, who was one of the earliest, one of the most coherent, I should say, advocates of this point of view, elevated the living world as being the most important place where you can find evidence for, as he thought, a deity. Don't look at astronomy, he said, look at living things. But what Darwin did was to show that even the worst case, even the most difficult case, that's the living case, has a perfectly rational, simple explanation. You do not need to resort to the idea of a designer. That was an astonishing intellectual achievement. Something as complicated as an eye, something as complicated as a heart, even a brain. Who would have thought that by the laws of physics, unaided, unviolated, just filtered through this brilliant process of natural selection, evolution by natural selection, that the blind laws of physics could produce the illusion of design as complicated and as persuasive as we see in the living world? Well, our colleagues on the other side have probably mostly given up on the living world. That was their happy hunting ground. That was the best place for them to operate, as Paley recognized. So they've been forced back now into places like the origin of the cosmos, the origin of the universe. And they like to point to the origin of the universe and say, well, science can't explain the Big Bang, or science can't explain where the laws of physics come from. Physicists are working on that. That's what scientists do. They don't lie down and pathetically say, oh, we don't understand it, so God did it. Scientists actually work on the problem. They set to work, they roll up their sleeves, and they work on the problem. One day, physics will answer those deep questions. And even if it doesn't, even if physics doesn't answer those questions, what on earth makes you think that religion can? Thank you very much.
Douglas Geivett.
The three of us here hold that life and the universe do have a purpose, but only if God exists. Recall the two contentions that William Lane Craig mentioned in his presentation. Number one, if God does not exist, then the universe has no purpose. And two, if God does exist, then the universe does have a purpose. He spoke of this God as the God of biblical monotheism for a reason, and that is that this God is a God who does more than exist. The God of biblical theism purposefully created the universe. This God also created human persons in the divine image. And so God has endowed human beings with certain properties and capacities, including rationality, demonstrated here today, consciousness, felt by each one of you, capacities for interpersonal relationship, moral responsibility, and freedom of self-determination. You are free to choose whether to be here today or not. And God continues to be personally interested in the lives of all individuals, whether or not they believe in God. But God has made special provision for loving relationship with those who endeavor to please God by doing God's will. Cheerful obedience to the loving will of God fulfills the highest ideal of living a purposeful, meaningful, deeply fulfilling life. Now, our colleagues here may agree with our two main contentions. If they agree, though, with these two claims, then presumably they believe that the universe has no purpose. And so it seems from the things that they've said in their opening statements. And this because they believe that God does not exist. But let's suppose that they disagree with our first contention and that they hold that life and the universe do have a purpose, even if God does not exist. Like us, they need to say something about what this purpose is. And Michael Shermer attempted to say that, but of course, many of the practical suggestions that he gave about how to live our lives for purposeful aims are things that theists and atheists can agree to. I would like to know what is distinctive about the atheistic point of view. If the universe exists by accident, then there is no intention behind the origin of the universe. Apparent design in the universe is a bizarre figment. And it would be a bizarre figment for it to be so apparently designed and yet not really designed, as Richard Dawkins thinks. The universe is not moving toward any goal, and neither is human behavior or human history. Stuff happens, and that's about it. There is no real ideal pattern for human behavior in the good life, nothing ultimate and transcendent that gives us a lodestar for how we should pursue things that matter. Personal meaning is really whatever you can make of it artificially, if you can do anything about it at all. Now, if any of those on this side believes that life in the universe has a purpose, that purpose, I believe, rests entirely on an arbitrary existential choice at best. Now, the irony of this leads us to evidence that God exists, because this choice that we might make without the idea of God for a meaningful existence is only possible because we are endowed by God with a capacity of self-determination. They can't explain why we experience freedom and are capable of planning and developing projects and following our aspirations without reference to a personal God who has endowed us with that freedom. So any arbitrary existential choice about the purpose of life, if it really is a choice, depends ultimately on the existence of a freedom-bestowing God. And if this is true, then a choice that denies God is a choice for what you might call an absurdly meaningful life. The meaning of any life that rejects God and God's loving will is a form of rebellion against ultimate purpose. For some, in fact, meaning is found in defying God by not believing in God. What about the case for God's existence then? The evidence is rich and complex, and I as well have written in detail about this. But this morning, I wish to point out that our collective interest in this question, the whole point of the conference centering around purpose, does the universe have purpose, is itself a signpost for the existence of God. To be concerned with a question like this, we have to be creatures of a certain kind, a naturalistic, evolutionary account of human existence and human nature, it seems, cannot explain the capacities we have as creatures to take seriously this problem of human purpose. If we were nothing but stardust or an accidental collocation of atoms, as Bertrand Russell said, there would be no question of human purpose and no problem of human meaning, and then no point in this conference. Thank you. Y gracias.
William, welcome to the ring. 3 minutes, please.
As I look at my notes for the debate this afternoon, I think there's wide agreement among us on the two contentions that we said we would defend. First, that if God does not exist, then there is no purpose for the universe, and our colleagues seem to agree with that. Secondly, on the other hand, if the God of biblical theism does exist, then clearly there is a purpose for universe and for life, and that's found in relationship with God. The question then is, have the two sides presented arguments and evidence for or against the existence of God? Now, so far as I can see, all I've heard from the atheist side is the argument from evil, which I answered and has yet to be replied to. We heard an argument from evolutionary development, but that obviously doesn't prove that God is not the supervisor who created life through evolution. That doesn't in any way prove atheism. I haven't seen any other argument for atheism in tonight's debate. So while we can agree that if God does not exist, life has no purpose, we've not heard any good or compelling evidence for the antecedent of that conditional, that God does not exist. By contrast, I think we've heard 10 arguments that I list for the existence of God. The argument from why anything exists rather than nothing, the argument from the beginning of the universe, the argument from the fine-tuning of the universe for life, the argument from objective moral values, the argument from the possibility of God's existence, David Wolpe's argument from the comprehensibility of the universe, number 8, the argument from the law-like structure of the universe, number 9, Doug Geivett's argument from the nature of existential choice, and finally, number 10, the very nature of human beings as capable of asking questions of purpose. All of these, I think, constitute a powerful cumulative case for thinking that there is a transcendent creator and designer of the universe who is the locus of absolute moral goodness, and in relationship with whom we can find the purpose and meaning of the universe. I think the most reprehensible position represented in tonight's debate is Richard Dawkins' claim that why questions are just silly. These are the deepest existential questions that human beings can ask, and to refuse to ask such why questions is to reduce human being to mere animals, which is, of course, exactly what Professor Dawkins believes. We're just animated chunks of matter in motion. Love, questions of meaning, and so forth are all ultimately just spin-offs of the blind bioevolutionary process. But if God exists, then clearly these are meaningful questions. These are vital questions for the nature of human existence and destiny. The tragedy would be that if God does exist and you miss his purpose for your life because you think these are silly questions and therefore don't need to think about them, would be the ultimate tragedy.